Jacqueline from Oklahoma says that while her memories have faded over the years, she recalls having an imaginary friend when she was young. Her grandparents, Granny Junie and Pa Hank, lived in a small home with a quiet backyard. Jacqueline recalls visiting them as a child. "I have very good memories of my Pa Hank," Jacqueline says on the podcast Monsters Among Us. "He would sit under the tree with me and tell me stories. The stories were often about his life and memories of prohibition," she says. "He was actually a very interesting character. The only problem? Her grandfather died in 1981, and Jacqueline was born in 1982. I don't think I ever realized that I was getting stories from a ghost," she says, adding that the rest of her family knew of his presence in the house. "My Granny Junie would never stay in the house on the anniversary of his death," she says. He did die in the house. Jacqueline also recalls hearing Pa Hank get up in the middle of the night when she was staying at the house. "It never occurred to me that these were memories of an entity," she said. In hindsight, Jacqueline says that even though her childhood imaginary friend was actually her dead grandfather, it casts a different light because it was a relative and not a stranger. "It never felt like ghosts. It felt like talking to my Pa Hank." On Monsters Among Us, a caller named Joe tells of moving to Georgia from California in the late 1990s. Soon after, he says his brother followed him to the Peach State and rented an old house built in the 1800s. "It looked nice from the outside. It did not feel good from the inside," Joe says during the podcast. According to Joe, things seemed off from the moment he helped his brother move into the home. "I walked into the house and went, 'Oh man.' The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I just felt ill at ease, like this place isn't cool at all," he says. Moments later, while carrying items into the bedroom, Joe says he heard whispering. A heated whispering, almost an argument, between two people that seemed to be hovering in the top of the ceiling area of the room, he adds. Joe ran out of the room and asked his brother if he'd felt something off about the house too. His brother had picked up on the vibe, but assured Joe that things would be all right. "As long as you're good," Joe says he told his brother, "I'm not good, but I'm going to help you. I'm going home and I probably won't come back here." And sure enough, Joe's brother began experiencing unusual occurrences in the house. The most alarming, however, was when Joe says his young niece was found wandering alone on a busy road with her hand up in the air. Police and other agencies were called to investigate the incident, and when asked, his brother's 4-year-old explained that she'd gone for a stroll with the old lady that lives here. "She just wanted to go for a walk, so we went for a walk." Given that the front door was too heavy for a 4-year-old to open by herself, no one could understand how she was able to leave the house. According to Joe, his niece said, "The old lady opened the door, then we petted the dog for a little bit, then went for a walk." She was so genuine and honest at 4 years old that he couldn't call her liar, Joe says during the podcast. Soon after, his brother moved and never returned. Considered one of the most haunted restaurants in America, Stone's Public House in Ashland, Massachusetts, doesn't have a ghost problem. It has a ghosts problem. Janet Morosini, a longtime resident of Ashland, is the bartender and manager of Stone's Public House, which was built by John Stone back in 1832. According to Morosini, even before she began working at the inn, she heard stories of the ghost of a young boy roaming the halls of the restaurant, which once served as an ad hoc hospital during the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. "It makes sense," Morosini tells Today.com. "That's where they would quarantine all the sick people," she explains. Apparently, quite a few souls have passed just due to that. The inn is also the site for other untimely deaths, including that of a young girl who was struck and killed by a train while she played near the railroad tracks bordering the property. According to Morosini, a father and son visiting the inn stepped outside the restaurant to watch the trains. After coming back inside, Morosini overheard the father reassuring his young son that there wasn't anyone else outside, despite the son insisting he'd seen a little girl sitting beside them. He's like, "She was sitting right next to me. She was crying. You didn't see the little girl?" And the dad said, "There was nobody there, it was just me and you, buddy," Morosini recalls. Other ghosts are said to haunt the old inn, including that of proprietor John Stone, who Morosini says didn't actually die there, but is believed to be watching over the place. One night when Morosini was alone at the inn, she says she heard footsteps walking directly above her on the second floor. "I was just like, there is no explanation for that whatsoever. I'm leaving," she tells Today.com. Still, she doesn't believe that the spirits have bad intentions. "I've never had that scary, hair on the back of your neck, gotta get out of the building feeling there." In the 1990s, Julie, a resident of Portland, Oregon, was driving out the city to meet with friends when she found herself in traffic. The 18-year-old soon discovered that the cause of the slowdown was due to a dreadful car crash, and to her horror, as she passed the scene, she realized that someone had died. A moment later, there was a woman sitting in my passenger seat, Julie says on Monsters Among Us. Though she admits it sounds crazy, Julie reports seeing a woman dressed in work clothes seated next to her, and despite being in complete shock, the woman in the passenger seat was even more freaked out. "She looked like somebody who just suddenly ended up in somebody else's car," Julie says of the incident. Panicked, the woman demanded to know how she got there and who Julie was. It was then that Julie noticed the woman had an unearthly quality about her and realized that whoever she'd passed on the side of the road was somehow in the car with her. "Mom, you need to calm down. My name is Julie and I'm here to help," she says, she told the stranger. Julie later went on to explain to the woman that she'd been in a car accident and somehow ended up in her passenger seat. The woman was stricken. At that exact minute, they passed a clearing in the trees. With some encouragement from Julie, the woman peacefully looked toward the sun, then disappeared. In completely disbelief, Julie pulled over and convinced herself she'd imagined the whole thing. Several days later, however, a story came on the news about a trucker injured in a car accident. Before they finished, they threw a picture up of the woman that was in my car and explained that she had passed away in the accident. Julie says during the podcast, "It was unbelievable. It was too much." The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio is widely known for being the location of the classic movie, The Shawshank Redemption, but the old penitentiary, which was shut down in 1990, also has a reputation for being haunted. Home to some of the most hardened criminals, the maximum security prison was once the site of murders, suicides, and other violent encounters, according to Teresa Aggi, author and paranormal investigator known as the Haunted Housewife. The reformatory had this incredible vein of violence that ran through it almost from the beginning, Aggi tells Today.com. "You can imagine why a place like that would be haunted," she says. "There's something negative there, you can just feel it in your bones." And there are, in fact, plenty of ghost stories from the old prison. "We ran into female spirits there, which I thought was incredibly interesting," Aggi said. "One of them," she says, "is likely the wife of a former warden who was accidentally shot and killed while pulling a box down from a closet shelf." According to Aggi, they've captured recordings of a woman crying and, on occasion, smelled rose perfume in the bedroom. Another spirit that's said to haunt the reformatory is a woman who sits in the prison chapel and cries. When you approach this woman sitting in the pew, she disappears. Other people have seen her walking, Aggi says. Then there's the malevolent presence there, according to Aggi. And with the help of a medium, she says she communicated with it. "He would literally be cussing at me," she recalled. While their sessions with the angry ghost were unnerving, it wasn't until he followed Aggi's partner home that they were truly terrified. One day, she saw him through a reflection of her window. She saw this thing in the back, this shadow figure, and she knew it was him. Aggi tells Today.com. After seeking the help of a paranormal expert, Aggi says that we haven't seen him since. In the mid-1990s, Robert worked as paramedic in a small Texas town and tells the story of a strange happening that he and his partner experienced on a call one night. After receiving a call for a female having chest pains, he and his partner climbed in the ambulance to make their way to the address. "We took off code 3, which means using our emergency lights and sirens," Robert recalls. In the absence of GPS back then, Robert says that they relied on maps and mailbox numbers to guide them to the rural location. "The address we were going to was a very rural one," says Robert, "so there was no streetlights and it was a very dark night, so it was very difficult to read the mailboxes." As they searched for the correct driveway, Robert says he turned off the sirens. After determining they'd found it, they pulled in only to discover they were mistaken. So we turned off the emergency lights as we backed up to the road and went up the correct driveway, he explains. Upon arriving at the scene, the paramedics realized that they'd been at the exact same address the month prior for a male suffering from cardiac arrest. In typical medical black humor fashion, we mentioned to each other that this was probably the wife who was now having a heart attack and was now going to go join her husband. They jumped from the ambulance, bags in tow, and began treating the woman, who, fortunately, ended up being all right. Robert says he sent his partner to get the stretcher from the ambulance so they could take her to hospital for evaluation. When he returned, he had this strange questioning look on his face, according to Robert. The pair wheeled the patient out to the emergency vehicle, and that's when Robert saw that the ambulance had nearly every light it was equipped with turned on. Strobe lights, floodlights, some interior lights, everything on. After taking the patient to the hospital, Robert asked his partner why he'd turned on all the lights. He hadn't. In fact, he reminded Robert that they'd shut them all off after going to the wrong address. Neither of us recall activating the emergency lights, strobes, or floodlights when we arrived at the house. There was no real reason to do so. We'd already gotten there. In the end, we wrote it off as her dead husband, letting her know that he was still there.